Welcome to Beyond Today Interviews. Today we have writer and director and film producer Tim Mahoney of Thinking Man Films. Tim has done 3 films on the Exodus, on Moses, and a new one coming up on the Red Sea Miracle. Tim, welcome to our Beyond Today set. We're glad to have you with us today.
It's great to be on the program, Darris.
We've been looking forward to this a long time. Perhaps you could start by telling us how it is you came up with the idea, the title of Padrões de Evidência.
Well, Padrões de Evidência, I was told it was a terrible name in the very beginning, but it was exactly what we were looking for. And you know, the scientific method is to look for evidence and see if you can see a pattern in it. The Bible is giving indication that certain things happen. Let's just say if there's an Exodus, it says, well, first, before there was an Exodus, the Israelites had to go into Egypt. So in the very first film, in Padrões de Evidência to the Exodus, we had to look for the arrival of the Israelites. Right. And what I started to realize was that sometimes people would look for one part of the story and they would try to build all the events around that. And you can do that if you can find and identify other elements of the story. So in our particular case with the Exodus story, what we ended up doing was we looked for the arrival of the Israelites, then the fact that they grew into a large group of people, that would be the multiplication, and then the enslavement of the Israelites. So you had to say, well, is there any time in history, in Egypt's history, where you would see those 3 activities happening, where a foreign group came into Egypt, that they were allowed to be there, they didn't like have a war to get in there, but they were invited in, and that they then grew into a larger group of people, and then they were enslaved. And then was there, the fourth part of the pattern was there some type of judgment of Egypt, some type of hardship that happened, which would be the plagues. And then the fifth one was, did the people who were the Semitic people leave? And then was there a conquest of the Promised Land? So that gave us 6 things to look for in a sequence. And so that's how our films have been created, was we look at the Bible first and say, well, what type of events would you look for? And in that particular case, we looked for 6 major events, and we said, then can we find a sequence of events that align with that?
I don't believe there was a single event that we can call the Exodus.
This person can't have seen all this. He imagined it.
So far, there is no documented evidence about the Exodus.
Exodus did not happen in the way that it is described in the text.
How can we prove that?
You look for a collapse in Egyptian civilization, and that's where you'll find Moses and the Exodus.
If we can prove there even was an Exodus.
There's been a lot of pushback against the Bible over the last 100 years. People have been not accepting it. They think it's a religious document. But what's very interesting is that, let's say Egyptologists, they will look at Egyptian documents, which are religious, but they consider them as history or Babylonian. And so a lot of these documents have mentions of their gods in them, but there's a bias against the God of the Bible, and so that they don't want to allow that God, that information to be considered historical. So, you know, it's kind of a double standard there.
So you've adopted this approach of establishing these patterns, and in your films you've found the evidence to sustain that approach.
Yeah, you couldn't make a film if there wasn't something there, you know. And I have seen a number of documentaries, I think we all have, where they're searching for something and they take you and then they never find anything.
Right.
In this particular case, when I first went to Egypt in 2002 for the very first film, the Exodus one, what really started it was I was searching for the route of the Exodus. And so I went to the very location where the Israelites were said to have lived. This place, which some people would call Ramesses, but actually underneath Ramesses was a much older town called Avaris. In other words, it was built at an earlier time. And I went to that location, and it wasn't easy to get there. And I went to an archaeological dig site, and there was a man who had been there for 20 years digging. His name was Manfred Bitek. And I went to his dig site, and I like I said, it was very difficult to get there. I won't explain it, but you know, it wasn't in the protected area, so it was very complicated to get up to that area with a crew. And I showed up, and I had been emailing him for quite a long time, but he didn't respond. because he was
probably busy.
well, his offices were in Austria, but he was in Egypt, and so he wasn't answering my emails. And when I arrived, he wasn't happy. In fact, he was quite put off because he had a dig site. And what happens in archaeology is, in that area, they rent from the farmer a field, and they will then dig down, and they only have so much time to get there. They'll identify all the archaeology, and then they'll put all the dirt and everything back, and the farmer will get his field back. So he was under a time constraint, and so I come along and interrupt him, and I said, please, it was so difficult to get here, could I just talk with you for a few minutes? And he said, okay. And I said, have you found any evidence for the Israelites, for the Hebrews? And he said, so far, not. And when he said that, I was just shocked. In fact, it was almost like I remember as a kid, I one time ran into a wall, and you know how you have that ringing in your head. I was like struck by like a 2x4, and I couldn't hardly respond. And I started to fumble around to ask him a few more questions, and that began for me the beginning of a personal crisis of faith. And
when he said, so far not, those words from Manfred Bitag.
What he was telling me was that he hadn't found any evidence for the characters of the Israelites in Egypt there.
So you went into this with a measure of faith and belief. You had not, you weren't questioning, you were wanting to support what you personally already believed in.
Right. I mean, I didn't know that there was a question about that at all. You know, I went there, and I had heard, by the way, that he had actually found something. And, but he was telling me there, and there's different reasons why he had to have that answer. It's very difficult to suggest that where you're digging, you might be uncovering, evidence of the Israelites.
Right.
And there's a lot of political issues that go on that, you have to be very careful. Archaeology is political.
Yes, it is.
And so I would come to learn later that there were other problems. But what happened, and I think this happens to a lot of us, or to people at times, is there'll be something that will create a doubt in your heart about the Bible, or a doubt in your heart about God, and you'll be troubled by it. And you don't always tell anybody. It's not like you go around and say, hey, guess what happened? I'm starting to doubt the Bible. I'm starting to doubt, I was conflicted. I wasn't saying I was, it was something that, it was more like catching the flu. I mean, you start feeling achy, but this lasted for weeks. And finally, when I came home on a weekend, I was watching that footage and by myself in the edit suite, and I listened to it again. And all of a sudden, I literally started to cry. I said, Lord, you have to help me. What is the reason? Why is he saying there's no evidence for the Israelites? And at that moment, I felt almost like the room got cold, and a thought came into my mind. Everything your family has believed about the Bible, your mother believes about the Bible, you believe about the Bible, is a lie. It was like a chill came into this thought came into my mind. And at another moment, another voice, it was like one was on the left-hand side and one was on the right. On the right-hand side, it said, stop editing, get up, and go to your office. I got up, walked to my office, go to your bookcase. I went to my bookcase, read that book. I pulled this book out, and someone had given me this book about a year earlier and said, I think you need to have this. As a friend of mine. And I looked at it and I go, oh, thank you very much. And I stuck it on my bookcase. I never looked at it, never read it.
Which is what we do with a lot of books that people give
to
us.
I have a bookcase I have multiple bookcases full of books. And I open the book and I open it up and it's illustrated. And there, the very dig site that I was looking at, the man who I was looking at in the edit suite was in this book. And it was another whole understanding of what was being uncovered there. And the reason why he couldn't say that there was any evidence for the Israelites had to do with the time that has been given by mainstream scholars today for when the events of the Bible happen.
Which is?
1250 BC.
Okay.
Yeah, 1250 BC. But if you go back, the Bible actually gives a different date, which is 200 years earlier.
Right.
And it's 1450, roughly. And so if you look at that time period, This other scholar was saying that there's a pattern of evidence. He didn't probably use those terms, but he was saying there's evidence for Joseph and his family coming into that area, and this man has uncovered his palace. If the earth is, if the ground is here and they build on it, years earlier, there might have been something. So civilizations are built on top of, so in this particular case, there was an earlier city. And that is where the story of the Exodus and the early Israelites shows up.
So this Avaris, is it the place where Joseph was?
Well, what the archaeology was telling the archaeologists was that a group of Semitic people and the Semites, the Semitic people, that were different than the Egyptians were allowed to come into that very area. And the Bible says that Pharaoh allowed Joseph's family, Jacob and the family, to come and settle in Goshen, in that land of Goshen. And that is exactly what the archaeology showed. This small group of people comes in. Now, it says small group of people. So there's 70 men that were identified.
Right.
But that doesn't...
With Jacob.
That's right.
Came down.
But that's just the men. There were women and children. Right. There could have been 10 times that many. And then if they had servants and their flocks. So there could have been 1,000 people or more that came in. Abraham, you hear about Abraham, but he had... When he went off to chase someone, I think
he had an army.
He had like 300 men, didn't he? Something like
Mm-hmm.
that. So these were the princes, really, Jacob's sons.
It was a large entourage that came in with
Right.
Jacob at that time.
Right.
So you're saying that's where they settled, and that's up in what we would call the Nile Delta area.
Yes. On the northeast side of that. Yeah.
Right.
And that's where Manfred Bietek was digging.
Mm-hmm.
If you believe that the Israelites came at 1250 BC. And these are earlier, well, then you're going to say these are not the Israelites.
It's a different group.
So when he said, so far not, he was looking for the Israelites at 1250, or in that particular time period, later than this earlier evidence. But what this other Egyptologist, David Rowe, who wrote the book, I think it was called Pharaohs and Kings,
yes,
he was telling me, and he's an agnostic, by the way, he was saying, this is where it begins. And this is evidence for the Bible, and it's matching the narrative of what the Scriptures are telling us.
So why do you think evidence fails to change certain mindsets?
Well, I believe that part of it is peer pressure.
The academic community.
Yeah, there's a lot of peer pressure. I have actually archaeologists on that have told me that you're not going to go anywhere with your career let's say, if you start suggesting that the biblical narrative is historical, or if you start looking for the biblical narrative. So I've got interviews that communicate that. I have other interviews with scholars that have told me, we talk about this all the time in private. He says, yeah, that matches the Bible, that matches the Bible. Yeah, but I can't talk about it, I can't print it because of, And finally, this guy said, you know what, I'm about to retire and I don't care anymore, and he was much more open. So what I started to realize, because as I went on a journey, I'm going into almost 20 years in this particular area, I've interviewed some of the leading people in the world in archaeology and Egyptology, and it's been a wonderful education. Now, I'm a filmmaker, and I'm a journalist in a sense, and I'm trying to understand the story. Just because an archaeologist or a scholar makes a claim doesn't mean that what they've communicated is necessarily the truth. It means it's their interpretation.
Are you saying, Tim, that there's fake archaeology?
Well, I'm going to tell you that there's more to the story. It's like Paul Harvey said, and this is the rest of the story.
The rest of the story.
Yeah, if you're old enough to remember that.
I do remember.
But there's more to the story. Yeah. And so as I've interviewed scholars and I've tried to understand what was going on, they've taken a viewpoint that has a lot of conditions applied to it. Those conditions, once you start to unravel that, you go, well, wait a minute here. This is what you're trying to say? And the challenge for the average person is like, well, I can't figure all that out. Well, what I'm doing is trying to figure it out and make it simple for people. Why is it that we've never heard of these finds?
Because in the scheme that's used by scholars to date all these events, they're way too early.
We may be wrong 10 years here and 10 years there, but there's no way, you know, to shift centuries.
Because it would undo a lot of their books, wouldn't it?
Make certain moves, yes.
What led you to get into filmmaking and to even begin this, to get you to that spot that day where you were standing over the pits of Avaris?
Yeah. Well, when I first became interested in film was when I was 18 years old, because I grew up in a conservative home too, and I never went to a movie. I didn't go to a film until I was 18 years old. And then when I went to the first film, I went to a Billy Graham film called The Hiding Place. And I saw that movie 3 times in 1 week, and it was so powerful. And it was like the beginning of something new in my life. And I was always interested in music, and I thought I would be either in music or in radio. So I would hang out at radio stations as a teenager and got to know the manager. And I was headed to radio, and then I heard a radio commercial for a film school. And that's how I ended up moving from radio to television. And so it's been a long journey, but I think that God has callings on our lives, you know, and we're created to do certain things. And I think in my own personal life, I look back on it now and I realize my interest in history, my interest in film, my openness to people and understanding their viewpoints, different viewpoints, all allowed me to have the right kind of chemistry to make these kinds of films that explore the big questions, you know, that we need to explore. But my bigger goal was for myself, was to have an understanding for myself, and I'm taking this audience along a journey so that, and I don't tell people what to think in my films. I'm trying to be honest about, well, here's what I think, but you know, it's really up to you. Because in our culture today, people don't want to be told, they don't want to be preached to. In my particular case, I give them questions. And I can say, well, why is this evidence in a sequence? I mean, so why did it get there? Do you think it's possible that it's connected to what the Bible is telling us all along?
Has Manfred Bietek, to go back to him, has he altered his views at all?
Well, this is the exciting thing, is that when I met Manfred Bietek in 2002, and I had a crisis of faith, in 2018, I had the opportunity to go back and meet him again. And in Jerusalem, and guess what? He comes along now, as opposed to shaking my faith, he comes along with new evidence that supports the biblical narrative at the location, and that's in the Red Sea Miracle, the new film that we have coming out. It's a powerful scene of which we're going to build upon evidence for the Bible. I never in my wildest imagination ever thought that I would be sitting with Manfred Bietek again in Jerusalem and be able to be talking about the Bible and affirming it.
Well, why don't we hold that thought for our next sequence in this interview and come back to that, because I've seen it, and it's a fascinating piece of information to consider and to think about. So be sure and stay tuned for the next installment of our series of our interviews here with Tim Mahoney, Thinking Man Films and Pattern of Evidence productions that he has. We'll talk about the writing of the Bible itself and the Moses controversy, and in the future here, the actual parting of the Red Sea and information regarding that. So you'll want to be sure to watch that and see that, so stay tuned for those.